Hi everyone, today we are going to discuss literary lenses in my absence. So you're going to want to get some notes out and take notes on this information. You will obviously always be able to come back to this video, but it's best if you write it down to reinforce the information and have it easily available as we work on our literary criticism speeches next week. What I would also like to say is that if you have questions at any point in time, this is some pretty complex information, to please post about it in the discussion board, so that way maybe a peer can answer it or I can answer it when I'm back on Monday. So here we go. The first thing we need to take a look at is what exactly is a literary lens. If you've heard of this before, great. If not, that's what today is all about. So literary lens is a theory by which we can use to analyze a text. These are ideas that scholars have come up with that allow us to take a text, a book, The Hunger Games, any of the books that you've read, Harry Potter, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, regardless if it's new or old, we can analyze that in some way, shape, or form using the theory that we're going to be discussing today. There are many different types of literary lenses. For the purposes of our class, we're going to focus on 4. This will give you 4 lenses with which to choose for your literary criticism speech. The first type of lens we need to discuss is the feminist lens. I want you to take a second before I move on to think about what you know about feminism. That could be, you know about feminism in terms of understanding and knowing it for equality, or the idea that women think they're better than men, whatever it might be. The reality of the situation, though, is that feminism refers to a very specific ideology about equality between the biological sexes. And along with that, then, there comes some underlying parts to it. So in terms of what we mean by the feminist lens, is we're looking at an examination of the cultural and economic disabilities in a patriarchal society that have hindered or prevented women from reaching their potential. As you're writing, I want you to think about some different parts of the definition. We have the idea of cultural and economic disabilities, so we're looking at here not only pay disparities, women being reliant on men economically, but how the culture is built. By and large, we live in a culture where, as according to the feminist lens, men rely on women. A patriarchal society, there are 2 types of societies in this school of thought. Patriarchal, referring to men are in control and men dominate the culture. A matriarchal society, such as what the Native Americans had, would be a matriarchal society. So the feminist lens is looking at how women are disadvantaged or hindered or prevented from reaching their potential in a society where men dominate. So the big thing is that it forces women to be objectified or viewed as the other. So what that means is that women aren't viewed as the societal norm. They're viewed as the other thing, the thing that just exists. Sometimes maybe just exists as an object or as a placeholder in society rather than the backbone of society. And the other big part of the feminist lens is that man is identified as the dominant subject. What that means, what all this is leading to, essentially, is the idea that men are superior to women. When we look at the feminist lens, we have to look at it from that perspective. The feminist lens, I would like to take this opportunity to point out, does not mean that all of a sudden women are going to become better than men, or that women are trying to become better than men. The feminist lens is objectively looking at society, and a society where women are in some way, shape, or form less than men. And in order to fight for equality, that's all that they can do, is hope to become equal to rather than lesser, and never greater than men. Some more information about the feminist lens. We need to look at some assumptions. Assumptions mean that for the theory to work, we assume some things about our society. We make grand gestures, grand perceptions of society. So in the feminist lens, there are three. The first is that our civilization is pervasively patriarchal. What that means is that we can't avoid the fact that our society is patriarchal, that we've designed our society for men to be in charge. We've designed our society for every president of the United States to be a male. We have designed our society for a majority of the senior leadership positions within our companies to be men, and for men to be in control. To further that, though, we also have to look to the idea that gender is a social construct used to reinforce the patriarchy. Think about characteristics that are associated with being feminine or female. Typically, those characteristics are far less dominant than masculine characteristics. And we even will use gender oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes, as a way to demonstrate that boys shouldn't cry, girls should play with a certain toy or should dress in a certain way, and boys should dress in a certain way. We justify bullying of boys will be boys, even if that bullying isn't just to another boy, or if that bullying even is harmful. And so males are put into power even further because of the way gender works. And the final assumption is that female roles are left out and thus assigned to males. So if there's ever a situation where we don't know exactly, a new role comes up, we default it to go to men. For example, when NASA was first being formed, there weren't a lot of women that were part of that conversation because it was a new role being fulfilled in society. So the default was that role would have to go to men. The same thing can be said about a number of other organizations. The founding fathers of our country, women were very rarely involved with that, large part because of the culture, but we haven't traveled that far away from our culture in that sense. So these are what we've gone over so far are some basic ideas about the lens, but when it comes to actually applying the lens to your text, you need to look for some specific ideas from your text. And so here's what you're going to look at. You're going to look at patterns of thought, behavior, values, and power in relationships between the sexes. So I'm going to go back to using the example of the Hunger Games. If I want to apply the feminist lens to that book, and I want to start thinking about how can I apply the feminist lens to the Hunger Games, I need to look at the thought, behavior, values, and power in certain relationships between the sexes. So maybe I look at the relationship between Peeta and Katniss, and I look at the fact of how she thinks of herself as being the person that has to take control and help Peeta survive. However, at the same time, she's doing that all while playing into this idea that she's actually the damsel in distress that Peeta has been saving the whole time. So there's a power struggle relationship based on the thought and behavior in that relationship. Oftentimes, you also might examine physical or psychological dominance of men over women. That doesn't happen a lot between Peeta and Katniss, maybe a little bit psychologically, but only because Katniss allows it to occur. So even though that is a book that has a very strong female protagonist or main character, at the same time, there's some downfalls. There's some side effects to that. We have issues, and all of our questions, there's still questions that come up as a result of it. Before I move on, I would like to remind you that if any point you need to go back and hear me repeat anything, if you need to jot down any questions, or if you need to post questions in the discussion board, please feel free to pause the video and do that. But we're going to go ahead and move on to our second lens, the Marxist lens. The Marxist lens is based on the ideas of Karl Marx, which really looked at economic and cultural equality. So the Marxist lens examines the relationship between the classes, especially in terms of economical and cultural dominance. So what this means, and what this is really hoping to look at, is the idea that there are multiple social classes. What is the relationship between those social classes, whether it be the upper class, the super uber wealthy, the middle class, those that are in the lower middle class versus the upper middle class, and those that are in poverty, and who has the economic power, who has the cultural power? Does money equal that cultural power? Those are all questions that the Marxist lens would examine. And typically you're looking at one class or group dominates another class or group. If you think back to the Gilded Age, which was pretty much post-Civil War, pre-World War I, we have a very small percentage of the population, people like Andrew Carnegie and John Rockefeller, achieving massive amounts of wealth and treating the underclass like dirt in terms of working conditions and how much they were being compensated. And so that economic class was actually dominating another economic class. But this can also be referred to in terms of ethnicity and racial background. We have a huge problem still in this country that exists where the dominant ethnic group will assert that dominance over another ethnic group. So we need to look at some assumptions. Once again, these are, in order for the Marxist lens to be effectively analyzed, we have to assume or automatically accept these ideas about society. The first is that society develops based on economic organization. Marx would say that in order that our society develops based on the people at the top get what they want because they are at the top, and the people at the bottom have to simply accept what they get because they don't have the resources to say otherwise. And the second assumption is that history impacts who has all of these advantages, whether they be economic, political, and social. Whoever is able to write history, or whoever is able to come out on the upper edge of history, has this economic, political, and social advantage. After the Revolutionary War, the wealthy colonists were able to write history and able to have that economic, political, and social advantage, and they wrote that into how our society functioned. And then the era in which we, or the literature, exist dictates the reality. So if we're talking about something in the 1950s, there's a very strong middle class in the 1950s following World War II. So there isn't a lot of economic power that's being portrayed. However, there are huge political and social issues in terms of racism and trying to fight for civil rights that come to the forefront and dictate the reality. Today, while we still have those issues, we also have a bigger issue of how do economics play into that in terms of a wealthy 1% dominating everyone else. And so what we have to examine in a text is who has the power or money and who does not, and what is the result of that. So if I was going to apply the Hunger Games using this lens, I would look at the fact that the capital has all of the resources, all of the power and the money, and they ostracize, they punish districts like District 12 who don't have the money or the power. And so they're able to hold on to their power because they have money that the members of the districts desperately need in order to survive. The capital also orchestrates the Hunger Games, so even wealthier, more well-off districts still have to respond to that. And that's how the Marxist lens would be applied. We're going to take a quick break here to go to our discussion board. We've discussed 2 lenses. There are 2 questions here. I want you to just pause the video at this point and go answer those questions. You must post at least once about either of these topics, and then you'll need to post once about a slide that will be later on. So I'm going to give you a few seconds. You can pause the video and come back in a few seconds. Okay, we're going to go ahead and move on. You haven't paused the video already, I would, but go ahead and once you're ready to move on, we're going to move on. We have 2 more lenses. These 2 are much more simple and much easier to explain. The first of which is the reader response lens. This focuses on the thoughts and feelings of a reader as they read a text. So it's really, how did you respond to the text? What did you think about as you were reading the text? How did you feel as you were reading the text? And so I find that the reader response lens becomes very popular because it comes back to how did you react to it? But that means there's still some assumptions. The first assumption is that texts have no objective meaning or existence. Followers and supporters and proponents of the reader response lens would argue that a text has no meaning until you read it. You read it and you assign the meaning. But along with that, you bring your own field of experience to the table when you interact with the text. So I as a person that has been through college and has had multiple jobs and has had more, about 10 more years of life experience than all of you, will bring a very different field of experience to a text than you might as a 15 or 16-year-old high school student. And that's okay. But we have to be cognizant that those thoughts and feelings are going to be different because we're different people. And so what we need to examine are what thoughts, feelings, reactions, etc. did I have as I read the book. So as I was reading The Hunger Games, I was first kind of appalled at the system of, you're kidding me. They actually make each district donate essentially 2 of their children to fight to the death. That's pretty shocking to me. To someone else, they might say, that's an interesting idea. And so we need to examine what those thoughts, feelings, and reactions are. So if you're doing this, if you choose this lens for your book, then you just need to think about what were specific quotations that really evoked a big response for me, and why did it invoke that response for me? What is the text doing to get me to respond in that way? And the final lens is the historical lens. So the historical lens is just what it sounds like. It examines the text based on the historical context in which the author was writing. The time that the story is written in could have some impact, but it's more going to be focused on when did the author write. For example, you may, once you get to American literature, read The Crucible, which was a play by Arthur Miller. Arthur Miller was writing The Crucible after World War II was over. However, in the idea of the Red Scare and McCarthyism and being afraid to be outed as a potential communist was running rampant in our society. However, he sets it during the Salem witch trials when a very similar event was occurring. It was just a different context. If we were examining that using the historical lens, we're going to look at the time Miller was writing in rather than the time the actual story was set. So you have to do some homework on your author for this one. There are some assumptions. The first is that authors are impacted by the context they write in. So authors will have a reaction to what's going on. Arthur Miller's reaction was to the Red Scare. Someone that's writing today might have a reaction to the situation with ISIS, or someone writing in the early 2000s might be responding to September 11th, 2001. And the idea is that they want to help readers navigate and understand their time. The biggest reason that dystopian lit and shows about zombies are incredibly popular right now is because we've started to really think about what happens if there's some big catastrophe. What happens if the world were to end as we know it? And so authors are trying to help readers navigate and understand all of those elements about our time. So what you need to examine are the social, political, economic, cultural, and/or intellectual climate of the time in which the text was written. Not the time currently and not the time in which the text occurs, but look at what year it was written in and what the author experienced. Writers will oftentimes use their experiences to be very therapeutic. Suzanne Collins was writing The Hunger Games just as the idea that the world was going to end in 2012 was going into full swing. So she knew that as she was contemplating that, she wanted to figure out what would happen if something were to make the world as we knew it end. And that's where The Hunger Games came from. And that's where all of the dystopian literature is coming from. So that's the historical lens. You're looking at specifically when was the author writing, how does that impact the author and their writing. So here's our next discussion board topic. There are 3 questions here. You need to post about at least one of these questions as well. Please feel free to create new threads in the discussion board, add new questions, jot down any questions you want me to address on Monday when I'm back. And start thinking about, where does my book fit in with one of these lenses? That's really the big takeaway for today, is which lens or lenses do I still have questions about, as well as which lens or lenses would I be most likely to apply to my book? Because once we get into Monday in the specific assignment, you'll need to take one of these lenses, or maybe a couple of these lenses, and apply it to various parts of your book. So if you have any questions, please jot them down. Feel free to email them to me or post them in the discussion board. And I hope all of you have a fantastic weekend.